everyone. My name is Dan Shimolinski. People like to call me Shimmy, and you can too. And we are back with our sample school, our deep dive into Soundpaint. And so far we have covered a lot of ground, browsing programs and parts in the browser window, loading those parts and affecting them in various fun ways in their respective slots, taking a deep dive look into all the controls we have in the rack section, the effects section, and today we are tackling the ARP. There's definitely a lot here, so I'm gonna go ahead and break down this ARP piece by piece for you and show you why it's one of my favorite aspects of Soundpaint. ARP is short for arpeggiator. In its truest definition of the word, to arpeggiate a series of notes is to cycle through them in some sort of pattern, some sort of direction, most often used to talk about playing maybe the individual notes of a chord or a greater harmonic structure. So for example, if I were to play a C major triad, C, E, G, if I play those all at once, that's a C major triad. But let's say I play them cyclically in an order. Let's say I'm gonna play them up the scale. Going up those notes and starting again and going up once again. I am arpeggiating those notes. It doesn't just have to be going up though, I can go down as well. Or I could even go up and then down. Those are all versions of arpeggios. You're playing the notes in succession, in some sort of order, in some sort of direction. Arps, as they've come to be known, do that for you. So step one is heading over to the ARP section and turning it on. And right away, you'll notice a couple things about the default settings. We have an order, so up, which means I guess it's gonna arpeggiate up, right, just as I was doing. Octaves, note repetitions, and intervals. Before I get into changing too many parameters, I'm just gonna go ahead and play that same C major triad using the default settings of the ARP and see what Soundpaint does with it. Very cool, right? It's doing that bodode, bodode, bod for me, so I don't have to. And you can change the direction as well. Or my favorite, which is random. You can also do as played, which means if I decide to play maybe the first note and the last note and then the middle note, it will arpeggiate in that order. But this is really useful if I have a more complex chord. So that involves jumping an interval down, but it's in the order that I played the notes. For now, I'm just gonna leave it on up and talk about some of the other parameters. Your octave control controls how many octaves those series of notes are played in. So right now, this is one single octave. It's on one octave. If I change the octaves to 2, it's now going to play those sequence of notes in the order that I've selected in the original octave, and then again, an octave above. So it's playing bododa, which is the lower octave, the actual octave I'm playing the notes, and then it's playing bududet, an octave above. And if I change the chord, it will just do that same thing up an octave. So it takes whatever changes I make in the original octave and transposes it up another octave. We can go up to 4 octaves. Pretty cool, right? Now we have note repetitions, which is currently set to 1, but if we switch it to say 2, it plays each note of the arpeggio twice. Interval means it will transpose your ARP up some interval of notes. So octaves transpose the notes up an octave. But let's say I want them to go up a 5th, right? If I want it to go, I can do that using the interval parameter. And this interval parameter is in semitones. So a 5th is 7 half steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now when I play that same C major chord, it will arpeggiate the notes in C, and then it will transpose that shape up 7 semitones and do it again a 5th above. So it's taking that shape, playing it through the notes, going up the amount of intervals that I've set here, playing it there, and then restarting. If you're wondering how we affect the speed of that, the tempo of that, you have a DAW sync option, or you can just set the tempo manually. So we have all these note speed options here. It's ripping, and you can see the little line on top of our visualizer here as to how fast it's really ripping. So you can either affect the note division or the overall tempo. Now, if I want to affect the length of those notes, so in other words, how short or punctuated those notes are, I can reduce that using this slider here, and you'll see that it's represented in the visualizer as well. Here's what that sounds like. So full value plays the full duration of each note, and shortening that length allows you to get a little more of a percussive element. Let's talk about swing. In short, swing rhythm essentially turns 2 even eighth notes into a dotted eighth note and 16th note. So instead of bop, 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 you get bop, 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 bop. That is swing. Right now when I play that triad, everything is completely even. But if I want to add a little bit of swing, a little bit of lilt, a little bit of space between those notes, I can increase my swing percentage. Pretty cool, right? Let's talk about analog in the context of an ARP. This is going to make the ARP less steady. So right now we have analog set to 0. I'm gonna slowly increase the analog, and you're gonna hear that the consistency of the tempo becomes less reliable. This is sort of to emulate maybe older sequencers that aren't quite in tip-top shape. And I think it's kind of cool, especially if you get into some of the faster articulations. You know, you can get some really randomized kind of glitchy sounds out of this thing. And you've got a cool piece of modern contemporary music. We have a parameter called early late, and the way that I understand this is it kind of acts as an offset for the ARP. So it's set to 0 right now, and basically if I play a chord, it's just gonna go right into it. But let's say I offset it by 25%. It's gonna play that first note, and then the rest of the ARP is going to be offset by 25%. I'll make it 50% so you can really hear it. There's gonna be a gap between the first note and the rest of the ARP. This can be a really creative way to kind of throw your ARP off of the grid, make it kind of feel a little more unstable, but still stay within a consistent pulse. In Soundpaint, you should really just experiment with everything and see what comes out. Then we have the pan settings, which is a toggle and then pops open a little window over here. Basically, the ARP allows you to pan each note, ping left and right, almost like a ping pong delay, sending each note of the arpeggio to your left and right speakers. If I want every note to be somewhere different, in a different part of my speaker, in a different part of my stereo image, I'm gonna set the rate of my pan to the same note value, 16th notes, and I'm gonna set the width to 100%. Now when I play that chord, every note should ping left and right. Let's go really slowly. Let's talk a little bit about this visualizer up top, because this is a very, very cool feature. So first off, these bars, they move. And what this does is it dictates the velocity of each step. You'll see how it's gonna start to flow, and the volume will go up and down as each step of the ARP hits a different velocity. Now where this is really effective is where we have a library with velocities sampled. So let's get our trusty 1928 Steinway. I'm gonna draw a nice, even velocity curve to give you the idea. If I want to do a ramp kind of thing, I could start really low and go all the way up and then back down very quickly. So you can draw in the velocities into our visualizer here. Now the next thing you might notice is that there is a lot of blank space over here, and that's because you can increase the length of this arp. So say I want to do something a little more complex than just 16 steps, which is what we have here. You can go all the way to 32 and draw an even more detailed velocity curve. Isn't that cool? I do want to point out right now that we are in keys mode, which means that it will change as I'm playing keys. The arp will start as I push down a chord, but if I switch over to hold mode, I don't have to do that. And it will only change when I go to a new chord. But that's really great, so you don't have to hold down your hand the whole time. The next really cool feature of this arp is that we have these numbers down here. The numbers will transpose the note of the arp up a certain interval. The clearest way I can demonstrate these interval transposers is just to play one single note, which if you're just holding one note, we'll just run through the velocities on that note, right? If I add a second note, it'll arpeggiate between those two, third note, fourth note, right? So if I just play one note, and I start changing these numbers, it'll start doing an interval based off of that note when it gets to those steps. So you can play a little bit of a sequence if you want. So I have velocity control and I have per step intervallic control as well. And again, these are in semitones or half steps. I did want to touch on one more setting in the type category here, which is chord. Chord basically arpeggiates a whole chord at once. So before, when I played a C major scale, it was arpeggiating the notes of that chord. In chord mode, if I hold a chord down, it repeats the whole chord. Because if I want to arpeggiate a chord using these intervals, I can do that. Also, if you want to limit it to just 4 steps, you can really define your whole arpeggio or sequence length up top. So now I've put in 2 intervals below, so it will take that chord and transpose them up a 4th and a 5th on the 2nd and 3rd step. Pretty neat, right? So that's kind of the bread and butter of the arp section. We're gonna move on to the second half of this amazing arp, but in doing so, I'm gonna show you the 2 clear functions. The first is clear steps. Clearing steps maintains all of your settings down here, but clears all the per step information that you see here. So individual velocities, note relationships. If you click clear steps, it goes back to default. Your settings down here remain the same. If you want to clear everything, those steps plus all these settings down here, you just click clear all. And now we're back to square one. And now we're going to talk about the second aspect of this amazing arp, a sequencer. A sequencer does not cycle through a chord like an arpeggiator does, but it will play a sequence of notes that you put into it. Allow me to demonstrate. This area here mainly deals with the arp, and this area here deals with the sequencer. I'm gonna switch to step mode, and you'll notice that I've lost the interval control and I don't have velocities yet, and I just have my step set on 1 and it's ready to record my sequence. I'm gonna play a series of notes now. A nice little melody. You'll notice that it has marked every single note that I played, as well as its corresponding velocity. Now when I click play, it plays through that sequence of notes that I just put into the sequencer. There are a couple controls that now don't matter as much, like there is no specific order, so this window won't change your sequence, it's just gonna play through the sequence as is. However, intervals will transpose your sequence up if you want it to. So I've got 3 half steps in here, 3 semitones. So I started my sequence on C, which means it will play it again starting on E flat. my octave control still works as well. So what I've got going is a recorded sequence of notes that I've played into the arp. It plays it in one octave, it transposes it up the interval that I've set, and then it does that whole thing in 2 octaves. You can of course adjust your velocities later on after you've recorded a sequence. If you don't like what you played, you can still have control that way. And likewise, you can change a note if you need to. So maybe I don't like that note right there. I can just select that step and play a different note. And that's what it becomes. If you want to skip a step, you can just move over to the next step and start recording there. Pretty useful. The other way you can input notes is to enable live mode. Now watch what happens here. If I click live, the sequencer starts running, which means that when I play a note, it will drop that note at that velocity wherever that playhead is. Let's try it. So that's a creative way to put in notes into your arpeggiator. You might come up with some things that you wouldn't naturally hear, but is really fun if you're kind of taking that pointillistic approach to it. Obviously, the play button plays the sequence. If you want to trigger the sequence, you can select trigger, which means that it will start the sequence when you push down a key. And the key you push down does not matter. So that's useful if you want to do a note on start to your sequence or arp. Now I've left out the best for last, and this is something that's not immediately apparent from the interface, but this sequencer can do it. It is a polyphonic sequencer. As we've discussed before, monophonic means one note at a time. But what if I want to input different chords on different steps of my sequence? You can do that. I'm going to go ahead and clear the steps and go back to step input, and I'm going to play a chord. Now, you may notice that it just says D4, but I know I played a chord there, and I know that chord is living on that step. I'm going to do another chord. I'll do another. Maybe I'll do some single notes. Now watch what happens when I play that. It plays all the chords that I put in. You can have a chord of unlimited notes on every single step of this sequencer, which means you can do really creative stuff. I want that second chord to be louder. So it's basically, I can make my own songs, my own mini compositions. And I know what some of you are thinking. If you love drum machines, yes, you can input drum sequences as well. Let's clear the steps and go to possibly one of my favorites. I love this little thing, Brown Auto Very 64. I'm gonna turn the arp on and I'm going to play a sequence in to the sequencer using multiple notes. Check it out. So a super complex ARP sequencer. Nice and clean and simple on the surface, but so capable. We'll definitely dive into the ARP a little bit more in future videos, but that's a quick run through of all the features and a few of the amazing things that it can do. Anyway, that's all I have time for you today. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I will see you next time. This is Shimmy, signing out.